All right, our sermon passage this morning is from 2 Samuel. It's chapter 1, verses 17 through 27. And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son. And he said, "It should be taught to the people of Judah. Behold, it is written in the book of Jashar." He said, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of a woman. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished."
Amen. Thank you, John. So in that lovable world of the Peanuts gang that many of us grew up watching, Charlie Brown, he often said this phrase, "good grief." Right? He said it a lot, especially as he's running to kick a football that gets jerked away by the 100th time by Lucy, right? Good grief. So those words, they're known as an oxymoron, right? They're a figure of speech in which two contradictory words appear together. Good grief, right? Good. The definition of good is cheerful, favorable, optimistic, right, proper. The definition of grief, pain, suffering, sorrow over the loss of something greatly treasured. So those two words, is the Princess Bride, they do not mean what you think they mean or whatever, right? But they don't go together so well, it would seem. So here's the thing that we got to think about, though. Good grief. Good grief. So though this phrase is meant to be an incongruent oxymoron, right, that causes us to chuckle, there is actually truth in that little phrase, good grief. Grief is actually a byproduct. When you think about it, grief is the byproduct of genuine, loving relationships, meaningful love. It means that you loved and were loved. The fact that you're grieving means that you loved something enough to grieve. I guess really think about, there's an old poem, well, part of a long poem, but we know the small stanza of that. You've heard it. Better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. We've all heard Alfred Lord Tennyson's refrain there. But here's the thing about that we really don't know. It was written as a lament. He worked on this poem for 16 years, and it's the result of the death of his friend. This is part of an elegy, which is a long lament. That's what an elegy is, a long poem of lament, that Tennyson wrote for the death of his best friend at Cambridge, Arthur Holman, who died suddenly of a brain aneurysm at 22 years old. They were best friends, very close. They say Tennyson was inconsolable for months and months after this death of a friend. And so this is reminiscent of David here, this thing in Tennyson's life. He thought about this for months, and he wrote, and finally this long elegy was produced, and that famous saying came from that. It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. And really it kind of reminds us that grief brings that up, right? It's the grief that shows us there was love. There was this. I guess the alternative to not grieving is not loving, right? That's the alternative. You don't want to grieve, then don't love. Never become attached to something. Never take something serious. That's the alternative to grief. Grief is the natural byproduct of losing something that was good. It was valuable. It was important. It was meaningful. And so grief actually helps us understand that, to consider that. It helps us to become stronger when we work through that grief. And so David today is going to show us that grief is normal and that it is helpful. So as we look at 2 Samuel 1, verse 17 and 18, notice what he says here. And David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and Jonathan, his son, and he said it should be taught to the people of Judah. Behold, it is written in the book of Jashar. So this is interesting because now David here is doing kind of what Tennyson did. He's thinking about Saul. He's thinking about Jonathan. He's thinking about Israel, the armies of Israel scattered on Mount Gilboa in defeat. And he's broken over it, but he's intelligently thinking about it now, and as he does, he writes this lament, and he commands. By the way, when it says there, the word said in Hebrew there, when he says, and he said it should be taught, that's literally could be translated, he commanded. This was a command. He commanded that it should be taught to the people, literally the armies, the warriors of the people of Israel. And it's written in the book of Jashar. Now, what's the book of Jashar? The book of Jashar is not extant anymore. It's not in existence anymore. But it was a book that recorded the lives of Israel's heroes. And it's mentioned in other books of the Bible, like Joshua. The book is mentioned. So we know that there was, in Israel's history, a book where they talked about and lamented their heroes. They honored them in this book. And so David puts this lament in that book to honor, and think about this, to honor Saul, Jonathan, and the fallen warriors of Israel. And by the way, it has a name. The pronoun there, it, for us, in the Hebrew, literally says the bow. So the name of this lament was the bow, probably in honor of Jonathan's weapon of choice, the bow, and also the bow that was a gift to David. But the idea here is this was a song that was learned, it was resuscitated, it was recited, there you go. It was recited, it was resuscitated once it died. They brought it back, and they kept reciting it. But the idea there is David said, I want people to know it. I want you to read it. I want it to be on your mind. And it's interesting as we get into this, why in the world David would put this song about their defeat, reminding them of Saul's death and Jonathan's death and the defeat of Israel. Why would you want your soldiers to memorize such a dirge? It was a funeral dirge. But we're going to find that out as we look at this. We're going to see, as David laments here, three aspects of grief. We're going to talk about that. Over this week and last week, what we see is the three aspects that happen in grief. And the first one is emotional. There's an emotional aspect of grief, emotional grief. We saw that last week. Emotional grief, that's the beginning, right? That's just this natural outburst when you find bad news or hear bad news or you experience a brokenness. The emotional grief is real, correct? I mean, we saw this last week in David's initial reaction to the news that Saul and Jonathan, they were dead, and how Saul died. And we saw that it says David took hold of his clothes and tore them. It was an emotional outburst. Possibly, many of you have talked to me about that, the swift killing of Amalekite, the messenger, right? The messenger that was ambitious. He came and he was ambitious at the beginning and he was dead at the end. He came and he said, hey, king, I killed your enemy. I did it. And he thought David would be happy because Saul plagued David all of his life pretty much, tried to kill him. And he thought, well, David will be glad. But what happened is, after the Amalekite said, well, I did it, David said, how could you do that? How could you touch the Lord's anointed? Kill this guy, and they kill him. So, but now I'm speculating. I don't know if that was all emotion. That was also part of God's command, by the way. The Amalekites were sentenced to death by Saul years earlier, and Saul did not carry that death sentence out. He disobeyed God. So the Amalekites still lived, so they already had a death sentence, and David just kind of helped that become finished out. But his emotions were real. They were raw. He was ripping his clothes. He was weeping. He was crying. He was groaning. We all suffer that. I'm just pointing out scripturally, that's natural. That's a part of life. You can cry, right? We can weep. We can be broken, devastated at the loss of a loved one or loss of something that's valuable or find ourselves in great turmoil. So it's natural, the outburst, the pain, the anger, the fear. This is what you could call eruption, right? It just erupts. Let's be honest, have you ever had grief that just erupts? It's like a volcano. You hear something and you just break down. The eruption, okay? So that's natural. However, it should be short-lived. It should be short-lived. Otherwise, this leads to bitterness and a critical spirit that just goes on, and you go down a wormhole that you don't want to be. And we all know people like this. They stay in that state of panic and chaos and brokenness and anger and bitterness, and it grows and it grows. So, though it's natural, we don't want to stay in that interruption. However, David shows us another aspect of grief, and that's the intellectual grief. Intellectual grief. This is really what lament is, right? This is what we see David doing when he wrote the bow. He's sitting back. He's been weeping and crying and tearing his clothes, but then he calms down and he begins to use his intellect, and he thinks and he puts into words what he's feeling. And he puts into words the memories and what those relationships meant, and the honor of the warriors of Israel. And he puts it down, and that is the healing process. But it's an intellectual kind of thing. We have to think. We have to stop and think. So this is the part that is needed, right? Because grief not only erupts, but grief abides. It abides. What do I mean by that? David is showing us that grief is not just something that erupts and then you're done with it. Grief abides. It stays a while. It takes a while to actually heal, right? It takes time to work through. It's a thoughtful and meaningful process to actually work through our grief, but we have to understand it's going to be there a while. And so that's when the healing can come, if we take our time to talk to people, to pray, to seek God's face, and to allow God to reveal the truth about, hey, this is the good in all of this. Think about this. Sometimes we can be impatient about this aspect of grief, this patient working through it. I'll be honest, as a pastor, there's been times I think, just get over it. That's terrible. Maybe you've done it too. You got a friend and they're grieving something. We're like, come on, good night. It's been 2 weeks already. I mean, I have heard people say that. Like, why isn't he over the death of his wife yet? It's been 18 months. Why hasn't she moved on from the death of that child? Come on. People die. I mean, I've heard sentiment like that, and sometimes we've got to be careful about our callousness in this moment. Yes, there is this fine line as Christians. We understand that we're not the psychobabble, psychoanalysis of our world that say, ooh, grief, here's the timeline. You're going to be 5 to 10 years in this, and you're going to be broken, and everybody this and this. You got to live in that pain. Well, that's not true either. The Bible does tell us there's a healing balm. Christ, the gospel. We are restored. We do not sorrow as those who have no hope. So there is a difference. But there is still suffering. It is real. The pain is real. The loss is real. So we do take time. So that's the fine line here that we have to understand, the balance of suffering and pain and grief. And that it is going to take a time. And that's what the Lamentations of the Bible assume. The Lamentations of the whole book written in the Bible called Lamentations. But here we see David lamenting. So the Lamentations of the Bible assume that our grief is deep and ongoing. So there is that understanding that it's going to be a while. It's going to take time. And it needs to be talked about, needs to be remembered, not stuffed in a corner and ignored. So that's what David is showing us here. So David's command, this lament, is to be taught and memorized and recited over the years. We are to remember this grief, this pain, this loss. Why is that? Well, that leads us to this third aspect of grief. So you've got this emotional aspect where we're just going nuts and crazy, not even thinking straight. Then you've got the intellectual side where we step back and we heal. We take time to talk about it, walk through it, think about it in a way that is prosperous for us. It's healing. It's good. It honors the event. And it gives God the glory, and we trust Him to heal us. That's what that part does. But then there's this motivational aspect of grief that David uses here. Motivational aspect of grief. And this is using our grief to move forward. This is when that grief actually moves us to change. Whether that's confessing sin or admitting, hey, that was my fault, or this and this, or whatever, and I had to change on this, or even our perspective of life, to realize, wow, life is short. I need to tell people I love them more and actually move on that. You see what I'm saying? So there's a motivation that happens after we lose something valuable. And we've thought about it intellectually, and we've looked back and allowed God to work in us through that brokenness and that loss to sanctify us, to make us better in the kingdom for him, to make us what he's wanted us to be. So the bow is what that becomes for David. He knows he's got to rally Israel. He knows the enemies are still there. He knows the Philistines have still got to be faced. And he knows his warriors have got to fight again. They've got to find the heart to stand back up. So grief now becomes a motivation. Notice this. Notice the bow itself. Let's look at this lament. Verse 19. Here's what he wants people to remember and say and recite to one another. Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. So that's how it starts. David is reminding Israel that they once were the reflection of God's glory. That's what this is for. But that glory is fallen. It's gone. And ultimately we're going to see that's because of sin and rebellion that they have fallen into disgrace. So David wants them to know. Think about this. Don't let this moment pass. Remember, we were the glory of God. We were his people. We were walking with him in obedience. But we are no longer the glory of God. We are a disgrace, a laughing stock, mocked by all the nations, defeated. So basically, he's trying to cause them to see that this grieving process should cause them to take things seriously, and especially their sin. Their sin, their disobedience to God. Over and over and over, they disobeyed. Saul began to disobey. And because of that, the results of that sin has destroyed the entire nation. And they all suffer now. And they're all grieving now because of that. So David wants them to remember that. Look at verse 20. He goes on. Tell it not to Gath. Publish it not to the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised be exalted. And basically what he's saying here is he knows, by the way, he's not so naive. He knows that the news has already got there. He knows the news of Israel's defeat is at the city of Ashkelon. He knows it's already being told in Gath. I mean, he knows it's futile to say, don't spread this. He's really not saying that. What he is saying, he's literally saying, guys, think about what's going on right now in Philistia, in Philistia, in those cities of the Philistines. I mean, he knows that Saul's death is front page news in Gath. He already knows the press has been printed and it's top billing. I mean, he knows that Israel's shameful defeat will be on every big screen TV in the bars of Ashkelon. It's just happening. Everybody's just looking at it. They're laughing. The women are dancing in the streets. Everybody is just rejoicing at Israel's God failing them. And the pagan gods of the Philistines are getting the praise and the glory, while the God of Israel is shamed. And really, folks, we know David's character. That is the source of his grief. Not even so much his loss, but the loss of God's glory. So this is what David is trying to do. Why would David then, one of the fighting forces, to memorize such a song that reminds them that the other nations are mocking you and making fun of you and taunting you, and that you failed because of your sin and you've been destroyed? Why would he do it? Well, it's motivational. It's motivational. Americans, I think, sense this a bit. We sensed a bit of this, David, motivational grief, did we not? When videos were shown of people dancing in the streets of Middle Eastern cities around the Middle East, celebrating the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. We saw that. We kind of get the idea of what it is to see and to feel that shame. David's using Israel's grief to motivate them, to rally them, to regain their will, to fight that enemy. that has now just defeated them. I mean, he's like a football coach, right? If you see football coaches, they leak the press, right? They pin up in the locker room a front page article or a newspaper article of a member of the rival team trash talking one of their players, right? And they'll put that up there. They want them to see that. Why? Because that motivates you, right? We were shamed. We were terrible last week. We stunk. We lost. And they're saying that about us. I'm not going to just grieve all the time. I'm going to pick it up. And I'm going to use that grief as a motivation to say, I'm coming back. So David is using this, right? David's grief then leads him to this next step. Now, here's the second part of this that we got to understand. This lament, this intellectual thinking about what went wrong, what happened, what's happening here for David, it leads him to hate the sin that ultimately is responsible for his loss. By the way, this is true for all of us. Even if you say, well, how is sin the response because my husband died? Or unless you killed him, there's no direct response. I'm just kidding. But what I'm saying here is this. Sin is the ultimate cause of every loss you and I have, ultimately. Yes, we understand there's natural causes and things happen, but why does death happen? You see what I'm saying? Ultimately, David's realizing, he's showing us, he's leading us down this path of intellectual reflection to say, wait a minute, the ultimate enemy here is sin. And grieving should lead us to hate that sin that has caused us to suffer loss. So notice this in verse 21. David says, you mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. What is this phrase of his song? Mount Gilboa, of course, is the mount where they were defeated. Mount Gilboa is where Saul's body was, and Jonathan's body, and all the other soldiers, and it's littered with the shields of the fallen. And so David curses it. He's angry over this. What is this shield of being anointed all about? In ancient times, the shield, some were leather, some were metal, but the anointing oil was a symbol, right? The shield itself was a symbol. The shield was a symbol of might and strength, and they were anointed with oil so they would shine brightly in the eyes of the enemy. And now on Mount Gilboa, they litter the ground. Discarded shields, dirty, once emblems of might are now emblems of disgrace, defeat, covering the land. So David is taking time to think about death and pain and the shame that it causes. And the idea is this, I mean, gosh, I know even the sermon, it's a little different today, but I mean, none of us want to talk about death. None of us want to do what David's doing. He's contemplating all of this, the death of Saul, the death of Jonathan, the death of his people, the signs of that death, what it means, the shame of death. So we don't want to even talk about it. So in order to do this, what I'm saying is that in order to move in our grief, we've got to stop and think and just take time to talk about it, think about it, address it. It's real. Death is real. The pain is real. The loss is real. That's what death is. So this is important for us to actually soak in that pain and have that grief so that we can hate the ultimate enemy. Here's the idea there. I say this at most funerals. There's a bereavement card that said, those who die never really go away. And that's supposed to give us comfort. But that's a lie. They do go away. They're gone. There's an empty void, and we miss them dearly. And that's what David is showing us, the reality here. But in order for us to actually heal past that, we've got to just admit this stuff happens. Death is real. Got to at least talk about that one. Richard Phillips puts it like this. Instead of facing the reality of death, many people try to avoid it. One approach is to refuse to mention the word death at all. You may have noticed that people do not seem to die anymore. Instead, they pass away. Others try to blunt the grief of mortality by normalizing it. So I think we see the point here. I understand we have phrases that we all know means death, but he's trying to make a point here that we can't just hide from it. There is a point where it's good to face death in all of its rawness. It's better to go to the house of mourning, Ecclesiastes tells us. It's better to go to a funeral home than to a party, a house of merriment. Because this is the end of all men, and the wise will take it to heart. We'll think about it. Forrest Gump's mom tried this on Forrest to try to normalize. Oh, don't worry, don't even think about it because this is normal, right? What'd she say? Dying's just a part of the living. Dying's just a part of living, so therefore don't even think about it. That's kind of the implication there. Folks, the Bible never takes that approach. It presents death. It presents us with the cold, hard facts about death. It describes death for what it is, our hated enemy. It's just right there. Richard Phillips goes on to address what I just talked about. He said, according to the Bible, Forrest Gump's mother is simply wrong. Dying is not a part of living, but rather a cursed, insulting violation of God-given life. That's okay for us to admit that. Death is the enemy. Death is not the part of life that God created. That was not the original plan. Death is a result of sin, and we should hate death, and we should hate sin. Death literally is a slap in the face of the holy God who created us. It is a violation of his goodness and his life-giving beauty that he's bestowed on this world and us. And David knows the ultimate cause of death is sin, and therefore he hates it. And folks, listen, here's what I want us to grab from this. He curses Mount Gilboa. He literally, that's what he's doing here. Cursed be you. I hope nothing grows on you. I hope that you grow no fields. David basically cursing Mount Gilboa the same way Jesus cursed the fig tree. And Matthew 21 is a symbol of the curse that all people would receive for rejecting him. Folks, this is what we see in David. This is how he's representing Christ here at this moment to us. It's a foreshadow. He hates death. He hates the sin that causes death. And he curses Mount Gilboa, just as Jesus did there in Israel. But we're going to see as we go through here that Christ hated death and he hated sin. And we should hate the sin that causes reproach. Proverbs 14:34 says this, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. That's what happened to Israel. When they were righteous and following God and obeying his commands, things were going well. They rebelled because of sin. And what happened? Death, destruction, judgment, reproach. They are now a shame to all the other nations. So what I take from this, and I pray that you will too, is folks, we should grieve over the loss that sin ultimately brings in our lives. We should grieve over the loss that sin causes in our lives. And we don't. We should grieve thinking about that man who gives into lust and ultimately allows pornography to destroy his family. We should grieve the sin in our hearts that cause us to lose things, because that's what sin does. It causes loss and destruction and ultimate death, and we should grieve it. But we don't think enough. We don't think and contemplate like David is giving us the opportunity to do. Stop and think about the loss. Grieve it, and then look at the cause. Ultimately, it is sin. We should hate it. We should weep over the woman who gives into the pleasure of gossip, spreading things and being giddy in the excitement of knowing what others don't, and then ultimately destroying friendships and relationships. We should grieve that sin. We should grieve over the man who's so greedy that all he thinks about is making money and working overtime and never sees his family. He loses them. Sin causes us to lose, and we should grieve it. That's what we're learning from David here. I mean, we should grieve over those sins in our lives that we have allowed to become pets. We treat them like little pets that we think we can control, not remembering that they are ravenous monsters that will destroy our lives. We should grieve any sin in our lives. This is what sanctification is about. We begin to hate sin and kill it, as John Owen says. Kill it, because if we don't, it will continue to grow and become an unmanageable beast that destroys us and takes everything we love. That's why this song should be in our minds, folks. That lament of loss should always be in our minds as Christians, looking at this broken world, looking at a nation that has turned its back on God, looking at the brokenness in people's lives, the confusion in children, the confusion in our world today of identity and people not knowing how they belong and what will make them happy. We should grieve that. But notice as we continue in David's lament, what else grieving allows us to do. Verse 23 and 24. Very interesting part of this. Now look what he says. I want to remind you before I even read this, just a moment to go back and review 1 Samuel. Not as long as we did last week, but just a real quick, just a reminder of the times that Saul tried to kill David, right? All the spear chucking episodes. All the chasing him up and down mountains and in caves, right? All of the lies told, all of the besmirchment of character and slander that David had to undergo because of Saul. And yet look at this. Look what David says here in verse 23. In this lament that he wants everybody to memorize as he honors the fallen. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. It's interesting, again, as we look back and we saw that Jonathan didn't agree with his father Saul on everything, and he actually had the same heart David had for God and righteousness. And yet you see a picture of loyalty here that he's trying to show us. They did die together. Jonathan was, even though he didn't agree with his father, he stood with him in battle, and they remained together in life and in death. He goes on to say, here's how he describes Jonathan and Saul. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. So someone say, wow, that just doesn't seem genuine, right? Because Saul was a character. He was a rough fellow. He disobeyed God a lot. He was a man of no integrity, lies and all these things. Didn't follow through with what God told him to. Yes, truth. But the other truth we can't deny that David is reminiscing on here is that in his younger days, Saul was a good king. Saul was he number one, God, when he chose him, he said, look, this guy is head and shoulders above everybody. So you're just looking at him. He would be the guy that the Hollywood producer would pick for the role of king, whoever. He's head and shoulders, he's good looking, he's strong. But not just that, folks. We know that he fought mightily. He had many, many victories for Israel. In those early days, he was God's weapon against their enemies. He did make Israel prosperous. He did make Israel wealthy. That's what David's reminding them. Hey, daughters, you lived in luxury. You were prosperous. So mourn the loss of Saul and Jonathan. I think it's I'm not going to spend so much time on this, but I think it speaks to the point that we're all sinners. We know that. We're all going to fail. Saul did not finish well at all, but what David is simply doing is honoring that which he could honor at this point in Israel's history as he looks back at Saul's life. And it happens, by the way, in our lives today. There are many preachers, some have fallen recently, that people have respected and admired and listened to for years. And one knee-jerk reaction is to say, everything that guy ever did is terrible, burn his books, don't even talk about any of his theology. But the truth is, David is showing us a different thing about that right here. He's saying, no, if there's good, we can honor the good. If there is truth that they taught, if there's a book that helps us walk through a particular book of the Bible and it's exegetically correct and theologically robust, thank God that he used that person at that time to bring that. And we can honor that moment. But David does call out the sin. The sin is obvious, folks. Saul's dead. God's judgment fell on him. And Jonathan was a result of that sin, his death, and Israel's fall as a result. So continuing on, look at David now as we close with this, as he grieves now personally the loss of his dear friend, Jonathan. He tells the nation of Israel to mourn Saul, but now we're going to see that that David personally grieves the loss of his dear friend Jonathan, much like the guy I mentioned, Tinnery, or whoever his name was at the beginning, that mourned his friend. Notice verse 25. How the mighty have fallen. Again, that's the theme of this song, how the mighty have fallen. Those who were once mighty, those who were once righteous, those who were once glorious, they've fallen. Again, a reminder to all of us that none of us are above falling. Take heed, those who think they stand, lest you fall. That's what he's saying. Oh, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war perished. Again, the theme, mighty men have fallen. They were great weapons of God. God used them strongly, but they're gone. Now, this verse especially, just in very quick, I know I have to finish here, but this verse in our sick culture has been taken out of context in our sinful, sexually perverse world to make allegations that Jonathan and David were homosexuals and in a homosexual relationship because of that verse that says, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. But again, and I could go forever on this, the Bible is pretty clear when it narrates. The narrator of a book of the Bible is pretty clear about revealing the sin of people. It doesn't sugarcoat it. And if this was true, I believe we would see more evidence of this. But there's no evidence in all of Scripture that this was the case. Jonathan had a son. He had a family. We're going to meet the son later on. David, of course, had many wives. That was one of his problems. But there's no evidence at all. What we do see here, though, is the difference of love and difference of relationships. And what he is referring to here is a bond of love that it doesn't compare to the love of a man and a wife. There's a difference here. Let me give you an explanation. We remember back in 1 Samuel many times and many exploits that David and Jonathan went on in battle together where they saved each other's lives repeatedly. They were in the heat of battle. They climbed up the side of a mountain and attacked a Philistine garrison by themselves, killing over 20 men. They lived through that to tell the story. So the idea is just like it would be if Henry was sitting here and I would ask him about some of the friends that he had in a foxhole in Normandy as hell is breaking loose around them. When you live through that with another person, when men live together like that in those moments and they live through it, there is a bond that surpasses other relationships. And that's exactly what David and Jonathan had, a bond. They both loved God with all their heart. They were willing to die for him. And many times they risked death together, saved each other's lives, and made it through so many battles together. And so he's simply saying, David, Jonathan, you're a friend to me in ways that not even my wife would understand, the things that we've been through. That's what he's saying there. And what a glorious thing that is, to be a band of brothers, to be in relationship. Now, obviously, God has told us our wives should be that close. And so, men, let's work on that. Let's love our wives. Let's talk to them. There can be a danger here when all of a sudden it's guy night every night. That's a sin on the other hand. So let's love our wives affectionately and lovingly and share grief with our family and our kids. Tell our wives and kids what we're thinking, not just our best guy buddy, but let's begin to share that. Our kids need to see us weep. David's kids need to see him weep over loss, just as much as they need to see him laugh over victory. And here's where we're going to end this, because again, I showed you that David's representing Jesus. He hates sin. He curses Mount Gilboa. He grieves over the sin that killed his nation and caused all this loss. Jesus did too. The shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35, is in the context of a funeral of a dear friend of Jesus, Lazarus, who died. And it says Jesus wept. He's there to raise him, but even though he knows he's going to raise him from the dead, Jesus is overcome by the grief that sin causes in death. So part of that emotion as a man, as Jesus is human at this moment, he's God, he's the God-man, but as that man at that grave of his friend, he curses death, he hates death. He knows he's on his way to defeat death ultimately at the cross. But he weeps in the midst of it, in the midst of that loss. So again, we should share that. He weeps as he enters the city of Jerusalem in Luke 19. As he comes upon Jerusalem, he's headed to the cross to take away sin, but he still weeps as he looks at the result of sin in the lives of people and the loss that they're suffering. He hates the cause of all of that, which is sin. And yet, he marches on to the cross. And Hebrews 12:2. This is why, folks, we grieve, but we do not grieve as those who have no hope. This is the difference for the Christian. Hebrews 12:2 says, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. And he is now seated at the right hand of the throne of God. There's our hope. Grief should cause the Christian to hope in Christ. It leads us to that. The ultimate, yes, we grieve over loss. Yes, we grieve over pain. Yes, we grieve over defeat. But the ultimate reason we grieve is because of sin. And it's our enemy. But the ultimate victory is Christ. He conquered death. He conquered sin for us. And that's what we remember in communion every week as believers. He's given us a sign to remind us as the church. Much like David said, remember this lament, sing it often, keep it in your mind. Christ has given us this supper to remind us, to keep it ever before us, that he is the victory over death and sin. And we have a hope that transcends all of this. He took that bread the night he was betrayed and he broke it and he said, this is my body